A concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury, or TBI, caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or by a hit to the body that causes your head and brain to move rapidly back and forth. This sudden movement can literally cause the brain to bounce around or twist in the skull, stretching and damaging the brain cells and creating chemical changes in the brain. What you might not know is that these chemical changes make the brain more sensitive to any increased stress or injury until it fully recovers.
After repeated head impacts experienced in sports like American football, the brain can begin to shrink and deform, causing dementia-like symptoms. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, is a serious condition first discovered in the 1920s with boxers, because boxers get hit in the head a lot, both during practice and during a match. According to one medical examiner in the 1928 issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association, nearly one-half of the fighters who have stayed in the game long enough will experience something they called being, quote, punch drunk, slug nutty, or peculiarly cutting paper dolls. In the 20s, they termed this dementia pugilistica. Word of the day, pugilist, which means boxer, but today we call this derangement CTE. Even nearly 100 years ago, these specialists were recognizing repeated cranial impact has huge implications. The brain is bound by the same laws of physics as everything else, and thus will move until something stops it, namely the skull. This is called a concussion. And even a minor one has a serious effect on your brain box. If a smack is hard enough, the brain tissues can become deformed or permanently damaged. Even lesser subconcussions, when taken together, can affect the brain long term. Basically, any activity where the head comes to a sudden stop repeatedly has the potential to trigger concussions and additively will cause this degenerative brain disease. CTE has been found in people who play American football, ice hockey, soccer, rugby, boxing, and wrestling, plus members of the military. Even people who only played in high school could develop CTE later. This is shocking stuff. And I just want to stop and say, according to the laws of physics, more pads do not stop the brain from moving inside of the skull any more than larger bumpers stop a person moving in a car crash. In another study from the 1920s, boxers' brains were looked at after death in an autopsy, which is when they realized something was wrong. Their brains had atrophied or shrunk. Even though we recognized this in professional athletes almost a century ago, it's only been in the news now because there likely wasn't an awareness of the problem before. CTE is difficult to diagnose because it manifests as behavioral changes that mimic other brain disorders like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Once the neurons and axons in the brain are permanently altered from the repeated impacts, so too is behavior, emotional control, memory, reasoning skills, physical and mental controls. CTE affects everything. The brain reacts to these impacts by literally shrinking. That's what they found in these boxers. It was called cerebral atrophy. In modern studies, doctors found as much as a 30% loss of the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. The damage centers on collections of neurons infused with a protein called tau. Tau normally helps stabilize neurons in the brain, but in CTE, it manifests as neurofibrillary tangles, turning the brain a yellow color. Neurofibrillary tangles are literally that. They look like the tau protein threads have become bundled up, and though how this happens isn't entirely understood by science, all the patients who have CTE have these tau tangles. In the end, as the brain shrinks and the amount of tangles grows, the person gets more aggressive and less emotionally and physically stable, and frighteningly, more suicidal. Or so it's thought. We can't look at the brain until after they're dead. Obviously, this is all bad, but can we do anything about it? CTE, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's are all called taupathic diseases. And unfortunately, research on living people with these disorders is still ongoing, and as of now, there is no cure, which means once CTE sets in, usually in middle age, decades after the repeated impacts occurred, nothing can be done. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is manifesting in athlete after athlete because they've spent their whole careers smashing into one another, either on purpose or on accident.
Sometimes, victims of concussion can experience something called post-concussion syndrome, or PCS. People with PCS may experience constant headaches, learning difficulties, and behavioral symptoms that even affect their personal relationships for months or years after the injury. Trying to play through a concussion, even for only a few minutes, or returning to sports too soon after a concussion, makes it more likely to develop PCS. Each year in the United States, players of sports and recreational activities receive between 2.5 and 4 million concussions. How dangerous are all those concussions? The answer is complicated and lies in how the brain responds when something strikes it. The brain is made of soft, fatty tissue with a consistency something like jello. Inside its protective membranes and the skull's hard casing, this delicate organ is usually well shielded. But a sudden jolt can make the brain shift and bump against the skull's hard interior. And unlike jello, the brain's tissue isn't uniform. It's made of a vast network of 90 billion neurons, which relay signals through their long axons to communicate throughout the brain and control our bodies. This spindly structure makes them very fragile, so that when impacted, neurons will stretch and even tear. That not only disrupts their ability to communicate, but as destroyed axons begin to degenerate, they also release toxins, causing the death of other neurons too. This combination of events causes a concussion. The damage can manifest in many different ways, including blackout, headache, blurry vision, balance problems, altered mood and behavior, problems with memory, thinking, and sleeping, and the onset of anxiety and depression. Subconcussive impacts, which result from lower impact jolts to the head than those that cause concussions. This category of injury doesn't cause noticeable symptoms right away, but can lead to severe degenerative brain diseases over time, if it happens repeatedly. Take soccer players, who are known for repeatedly heading soccer balls. Using a technique called diffusion tensor imaging, we're beginning to find out what effect that has on the brain. This method allows scientists to find large axon bundles and see how milder blows might alter them structurally. In 2013, researchers using this technique discovered that athletes who had headed the ball the most, about 1,800 times a year, had damaged the structural integrity of their axon bundles. The damage was similar to how a rope will fail when the individual fibers start to fray. Those players also performed worse on short-term memory tests. So even though no one suffered full-blown concussions, these subconcussive hits added up to measurable damage over time.
What can you expect for your path to recovery? Well, first, know that recovering from a concussion takes time. It's often days, it's sometimes weeks or months. The most important thing you can do is take care of yourself. To the degree that you can, avoid mental and physical stress. Many people become hypersensitive to light and sound, so a common recommendation is to avoid prolonged reading and use of smartphones and computers, and to stay in a dimly lit, quiet room. The idea is that a little rest now can save a big headache later. During the process of recovery, people often have trouble concentrating or remembering at their normal standard levels. They might have headaches or dizziness, blurry vision, trouble sleeping, nausea, and they might be more irritable than normal.